Everyone. We're going to start promptly. As you can see from this morning, there's lots to say and we don't want to run out of time. So I'm just going to go straight introducing our second chair of today. His name is Downey. He is the Professor of Visual, Cultural and North Africa and the Middle East within the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media at Birmingham City University. And he's also the Editor-in-Chief of Ibraaz. So we're going to keep to the same format as this morning, except we're going to have shorter presentations by all our panelists, and then they're going to join in a discussion and also take some more questions from you. So if you would join me in welcoming Anthony, and then we'll get straight to it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Yes, at the back? Wonderful. Folks, it's fallen upon me to introduce the four panelists for this afternoon. I'd like to begin, however, by thanking Rachel of the Mosaic Rooms and Shubak for inviting me to chair this panel. So we have four speakers, and I'm just going to very briefly give you an overview of their biographies. I'm sure most of them will be familiar to you, but I'll just go through this very quickly. So our first speaker today is William Wells, and William will talk for about 5 minutes, mostly around Townhouse. William is the director and co-founder of Townhouse, a non-profit organization for contemporary arts that opened its doors in 1998 in Cairo. I'm sure you're all familiar with Townhouse. He initiated and participated in various curatorial projects and collaborations with other non-profit art museums, galleries, and art fairs worldwide. What you might not know is that Townhouse will celebrate its 20th anniversary in 2018. Our second speaker today is Shireen Atassi. Shireen is the director of the Atassi Foundation for Art and Culture, a non-profit foundation that preserves the artistic heritage of Syria and supports its young talents. Shireen has a BSc in economics and an MBA in management from Imperial College here in London. Our third speaker today will be Hammad Nasar. Hammad Nasar is an independent curator and senior research fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, where he co-leads the London Asia Project. He co-founded the London-based arts organisation Green Cardamom, which ran from 2004 to 2012, and was head of research and programmes at Art Asia Archive, based in Hong Kong, 2012 to 16. Our final speaker today, and let me just find his bio. Ayman, where are you on this? Excuse me. Ayman Helmi represents Mawred Thaqafy, also known as the Cultural Resource. The organization was founded in 2004 to support artistic creativity in the Arab region and encourage cultural exchange between intellectuals and artists in the region and beyond. It assists artists and writers to develop and present their work to the public. So, there are four speakers today, folks. They will each speak for about 5 minutes. They each have presentations. We will then have a number of questions from myself. However, I don't necessarily want to be the only one speaking or asking questions of the panelists. Obviously, you came here today to speak to them yourselves, so I would actively encourage questions from the audience when we come to it. So, thank you very much.
Right. Good afternoon. I know that the panel is about representation and representation of artists, but what I've had to do is I've had to rethink this in a way, because Townhouse does not represent artists in a traditional way, in the sense of a normal gallery. For nearly 20 years, Townhouse has focused on the growth and the development of a wider space for creative practices to thrive. And in the way that we've managed to do that, or attempt to do that over the last 15, 20 years, is offering studios, working with artists straight from concept right through production to exhibition and presentation and talks and so forth afterwards. We've also run a series of skill-based workshops. We run curatorial programs. With critical writing programs. We offer opportunities for development in music, film, theater, dance, all the different areas of the arts in Egypt. and abroad. We run residential programs, international residency programs, as well as national residency programs. And we've been doing this, as I said, for like 15 years, building this incredible network, both regional and international. And it's taken us some time to sort of feel with a certain degree of confidence in what we're doing. But you know, really what this is all about is 2011, the uprisings. And when the uprisings happened, they impacted virtually everyone in the world. And certainly they affected the art world. And that art world, it is our art world. And within Egypt, basically what you had is, during that period, you had artists that died. You had artists that immigrated and continue to do so. You have other artists that just stopped working completely. Others that felt the pressure of censorship, the need to self-censor, the pressure of possible arrests, their friends being imprisoned. So, in fact, those people tended to evade coming into the downtown center where we're based, because we were just 5 minutes from Tahrir, which is the most contested area in the country. So this period over the last 5-6 years, with all of this happening, it made not just Townhouse, but several institutions in the region, I think, sit back and wonder about our relevance and our priorities and the way we perceived ourselves and how we could move forward. And it was at that point, I mean, we'd been working on this, and in December of 2015, to a certain extent, that question was answered. In December of 2015, the police raided our spaces. They closed us down completely. They had raided other cultural spaces up to that period of time in the previous 6 months. But at that time, we were the only space that they shut down us completely. So really, that gave us an opportunity to relocate somewhere else and as a staff answer those and address those questions. How do we perceive what we're doing? How do we take what we've been doing and actually make it relevant to the period of time that we're living in? And we were spending like 2-3 months every single day, all of the staff, trying to look at who in fact is our audience, who in fact are the artists that we are trying to work with, because as I just said, there's been an enormous shift in the ground there and in the entire environment. And we finally managed to move back into the spaces in February of 2016, and that didn't mean that we could program, but it meant that we could actually start cleaning up the spaces and possibly starting to activate and getting to know who our new audiences and practitioners would be. In April of that year, basically, unprecedented accident, a portion of our main building collapsed early one morning. It was April the 6th. And it meant that within 24 hours that the police arrived to demolish the entire building. Now this really was a catalyst for action, for us to actually stop and think about, okay, well, how do we now implement the things that we've been talking about, these strategies of activation? But before we could even do that, we had to empty that building. But almost overnight, the creative community that had grown up within and around our local community surrounded the building and defied the demolition order. The building became symbolic throughout the country in terms of independent art. It was almost as if that building fell, then somehow all of the raids, all of the censorship, and everything would have been successful. So there was a united front of local and international response to keep that building. Unfortunately, we were told we had to get out of the building. Everybody had to leave that building or the army would come. And we weren't sure what the future was going to be. So overnight, an entire community of people emptied the building and all its belongings. It was like a human chain that went on for 24 hours. And everything was moved into our factory space right across the road, where this was where we decided that we would then now activate the strategy that we'd been working on. We would bring together all of our activities that were possible, were plausible, into one space. And that meant that audiences, and we still had large audiences, would be mixed. So audiences for the different disciplines would all be working together or coming and observing each other's performances and programs and so forth. Our offices were moved into the open space. The talks, discussions, the workshops, the library salon programs, all in the open space. It meant the incredible cross-fertilization of all of these different people having open, free discussions about the situations that they were living in, and the new threats that they were facing in terms of producing and presenting their work, and even the discussions that they were having. But this was also, for us, something so spectacular, because not only did we recognize that the audience was new, as the young emerging audiences were also, but the audiences were people basically who had only been like 12 years old, 13 years old in 2011. They were not people that were necessarily engaged in the square. They were a completely different, younger people that had witnessed what was happening. We called them the witnesses. And their approach to the arts was completely different, and their contribution to the conversation is completely different. And the way that they perceive things. That has not meant in any way at all that we have shied away from presenting and producing work that is problematic. This final pitch that you're going to see right now is temporal semiotics with Malik Yakut, and it addresses the problem of tonality within the call to prayer. So it certainly brought out almost every single person who considered religion a no-go area of discussion. And in fact, despite their presence, despite the security people's presence, the conversation and the attitudes of the young people were able to sort of shift it back into the norm. And we recognize that we have this incredible defense, and it is the young people around us. More work, again, and I'm showing you, and I think finally what I'm going to just break up on is, this was the building. In May, we got the building, the actual papers of the building back. This was just literally in May before Ramadan, and work started on the rehabilitation of the building, and we've been working on it all through Ramadan, 12, 14 hours a night, all of the workers. They're rebuilding the entire section that fell, and it's non-stop, and the cost of the rehabilitation is all being covered by the local community and the art community itself. There's no foreign funding. So we're looking forward to opening in December. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Shireen, and as Robert alluded earlier, I'm speaking on behalf of the Atassi Foundation for Arts and Culture, a foundation that is probably the first family-based foundation that promotes Syrian arts and culture. Going back in time to when the foundation was set up, it was primarily set up to change the stereotypical views of who Syrians are. We're no longer the refugees, and we're no longer the victims. We were people who were trying to put our private collection that my father and mother built over the years to good use, and that is to represent us Syrians in a way that really befitted us. So the topic that we were asked to talk about today is really, how do we support the arts and culture of a country that we have no kind of physical, geographical connection to anymore, because none of us lives there anymore? How do we support a community of artists who are in diaspora? And how do we do that without even a physical space? So we are primarily a virtual foundation. You can call us, you can email us, but you can't visit us, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us just a minute out of the presentation and talk about the kind of support that artists did receive in Syria in the 90s or the years of 2000. And really, they got very little support as it was. The government kind of monopolized, and I think this situation kind of applies to every other Arab country. The government monopolized support for arts and culture. There are very few museums. There isn't even a single modern art museum in Damascus. There are no non-profit spaces or foundations. There's only one university, no research bodies, probably a couple of art galleries, and at the time there were the foreign art cultural centers that provided the artist with a venue for them to show their work. Fast forward, 2017, the situation is not any better, obviously. But if I was to talk about one positive, and that is the emergence of very private initiatives like ours, like Abdullah's Tijahat, initiatives that people wanted to take to actually support arts and culture and the artists who live in diaspora within and also within Syria. So what do we do? There are two types of different support that an artist can get, monetary and non-monetary, and we're not going to go through them. But I'm going to quickly kind of take you through some of the initiatives that we at Atassi Foundation have taken over the past 16 months since we launched. So we're very new, we're very young. We launched in March 2016 at Art Dubai. And what we did over the past 16 months is actually reach out to institutions. So we reached out to institutions to show the works of Syrian artists in different parts of the world. And these are two images of loans that were done to the Aga Khan Museum, one in October last year and one that is on at this point in time. This very much links to what we as a foundation want to do, which is not just to promote and preserve, but also to celebrate Syrian arts and culture. The Atassi Foundation continues its acquisition program, and obviously we are very focused on young artists. So over the past year, we have increased our collection by just about 30 pieces in the past 12 months, all from young artists who live in diaspora, primarily Berlin and Paris. And then now comes to the pieces that I'm very personally very passionate about, which is the exhibitions that we have been organizing. The exhibitions approach are very kind of academic. So we have organized two exhibitions, one in Art Dubai for the launch, which kind of taken a very archival approach to Syrian art. We worked with Khaled on that project. And we kind of took the archive of images and artworks and even the press clippings from exhibitions that occurred in Syria that my mom organized in Syria over 30 years, put that together, and it was a Syrian chronology. The next project we did was again in Dubai at Al Sikal Avenue, which was also curated around a theme of bodies and figures and faces in Syrian art from the early 20th century until today. And on the back of that exhibition, there were panel discussions, there was a film program, and there was also a research piece that we also commissioned. Now, these exhibitions are very important for us because this is our way to actually go out to the public and say, this is who we are and this is exactly what represents us. This is the way that we would like the world to know us, really. In terms of research, and this is my baby, really, I'm very keen on research. I find it very upsetting that there are very few academic research or even journalist pieces in magazines talking about Syrian art. And this is, so the first research that we commissioned was about, again, linked to the exhibition that we did in Dubai, about the faces and bodies and figures in Syrian art. But now we're in talks on two master projects, A and V. We're working on a lot of documentation and preservation initiatives with regards to these two projects. Does this immediately have an impact on artists? Probably. It is very difficult to actually, for us now, to kind of capture the impact that the past 16 months have had on artists, but we do hope, and we're working on making sure that we act as a bridge for Syrian artists, both in diaspora and within Syria, to actually reach a wider range of audiences and to experiment with wider range of activities and initiatives. This doesn't come without its challenges, whether it's political, whether it's demographic or social, but truly the approach that we have taken is to work very closely with other organizations and other institutions. So cooperation is very important. So I would like to work with, so we're collaborating with Shabak as we speak. We've collaborated with others, and we're looking for more and more opportunities to work in collaboration with others, because we do not claim to have all the answers and all the experience and all the knowledge. We are simply a family foundation who are trying to, one way or another, kind of bridge the gaps and create a bit of a platform for Syrian artists to operate from. And that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Hammad. And I thought as a sort of a sideways contribution to this afternoon session, given that it's about representation of the artist, and the last little project I worked on was a national pavilion of the UAE at Venice, that seemed like a good place for us to talk about representation. Because whenever you have national and the UAE, that opens up really interesting questions for a place with complex demographics. As I don't have to tell this audience, the UAE is a nation where 85% of the population or so are not citizens. And most of those, that 85%, are actually not Arab. So what does that mean? What questions does it ask of the nation, not just of race, but also of class? That becomes an interesting proposition. And I'm not going to sort of bore you with elaborate description of what this exhibition was, but just sort of leave you with this idea of what I proposed, this notion of play. So the exhibition was called Rock, Paper, Scissors, Positions in Play, and to think about that idea of playing as a way of making a place home. I'll leave you with that thought, and what I thought we'll share in the next 5 minutes or so is just little snippets of 3 artistic projects that this exhibition put forward. And then I'll sort of leave you with some questions that we can pick up in the discussion later. The first project, A Rumble Interrupted Our Chat, was by the Dubai-based artist Lantian Shi. What it comprised was a combination of objects in the pavilion. So, for example, this painting, which is a copy of another painting, but also stories and situations that spilled beyond the pavilion into the city and actually into the realm of the imagination. One of those situations was in the lobby of the Downey Hotel. And for the opening weekend, 2 jazz musicians from Hong Kong came and responded to a set that the artists proposed for them, which comprised classic American jazz from Lee Morgan, Egyptian jazz by Salah Raghib, and Bollywood songs. So pretty much the standard soundtrack for a kid growing up in Dubai. And apart from sort of leaving you with music's capacity to harbor stowaways, to smuggle meaning, the one thing I wanted to share was getting 2 Filipino musicians who live and work in Hong Kong to come to Venice to play in the UAE's National Pavilion was probably the single hardest logistical challenge of the pavilion itself. The visa. The second project I'll just wanted to introduce is by another Dubai-based artist, Vikram Devicha. It's called degenerative disarrangement, and as you see the sort of the geometric abstraction, and given the jazz that I just showed you before this, you almost sort of get straight away into a kind of a visual jazz, like a syncopation, summertime kind of comes through. But where this work is actually coming from is from the streets of Dubai. The yellow are simply the yellow of parking lines which get disrupted when roads are repaired. Yeah? So Vikram initially had uprooted these, they negotiated their purchase and hired the same masons who work on, in the municipal capacity to place them inside the Al Fahidi district as an art project. And then on my invitation, these 4 tons of bricks were uprooted and brought to Venice, because I think they did 2 things which I found really interesting. One is that with these bricks, what happens to value when objects leave one realm, sort of the realm of the municipal, the roadworks, and enter another, that of the art world? The second, and I sort of love the analogy of this, was that over the 6 months that these bricks hang out in Venice, they accumulate value. When they go back to the UAE, if they go back to the UAE, let's see where they end up, they will go back as what I call Venice return. Now, this is an analogous term to a phenomena that in South Asia is called Gulf return, which of course is talking about the South Asian labor who would go spend some time in the Gulf, accumulate capital of all sorts, financial, economic, social, and when they go back, they become, so this is not a derogatory term, this is just a social phenomena. So these are people who've accumulated this capital and they go back to South Asia. So in a way, these bricks accumulating art world capital in Venice and the South Asian laborers accumulating capital in the Gulf, to me had an interesting parallel. And the planes that you're looking at is actually the work, is another commission for the publication that accompanied the exhibition by Deepak Unikrishnan, who's based in Abu Dhabi. The story that he's written is Gulf Return. And this exists in the book as a paper plane that you can cut away, fold, and then launch. So Gulf Return lands on Venice Return. The story itself is, it's sort of surreal. It describes 3 laborers in a labor camp. One becomes a passport, the other a suitcase, the third the passenger that carries these 2 things into a plane and then ends up consuming everything in the plane. So it's both laugh out loud funny, but also deadly and darkly serious. And in that juxtaposition, I thought it raised some interesting questions. And for all these 3 artists, their ability to live and work in the UAE, as you would probably guessed by their names, so the UAE, which is of course the place that all 3 of them call home, they're all dependent on that precarious thing, the visa. And that such precarity is not always visible, and efforts to represent it can be very heavy-handed and can do violence to artistic agency. And I think these 3 projects and the work of these artists raise some really interesting questions about on what terms can artists survive. And that's what I wanted to contribute to our discussion later. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm happy I'm with you today. We missed the chance of adding my bio to the brochure. So I work for Cultural Resource. I am a program manager. I'm also a translator and a musician myself. And I'm based in Cairo, Egypt, where crazy things happen all the time. For you who don't know about Cultural Resource, it is an NGO. It was established in 2004 in Egypt. And it works mainly on artistic creativity and promoting culture in the Arab region. And this through supporting artists, cultural operators, even emergent organizations. This can be either directly through funding or indirectly through capacity building, publications, research work. Also, Cultural Resource works on improving the conditions of cultural work in the Arab region. We are working in 12 countries. This is basically done through our work on cultural policy. We have 8 programs. And Cultural Resource moved to Beirut in 2014. Okay. Then in 2016, we launched our most recent program, which is Be With Art or Kun Mal Fan in Arabic. In fact, we thought about this program because we found many things in the region that made us feel that this is there's a real need for this program that can support artists who are at risk. This program has 3 components. Well, first of all, it was developed with many partners, both international or Arab, from the Arab region, who have a bit more experience than us in artists at risk and defending freedom of expression. We have 3 components who are the main components of this program. First is emergency fund, which is fund we give to artists who are at risk, whether they are in their own countries or they are outside. Also, we provide them with residency in Europe or out of their countries, or sometimes also in the Arab region. We also have the second component, which is the Regional Legal Defense Network. It is spearheaded by AFTI, if you know about it, Association for Freedom of Thought and Expression. It's an Egyptian association. And this defense network is supposed to be pan-Arab one, with member organizations that support artists through defending them legally. So such organizations can either represent these artists at courts of law if there's anything of this sort. They can also provide consultation. And also they are supposed to make a kind of regular annual report about the state of freedom of expression. This legal network is still in progress. The first meetings should be happening this year. But we are very excited about it, and we think it will really meet a real need in the region. Also, we have the International Network of Cultural Space and Art Residencies. In fact, this component is not, we haven't started it yet. We have we are going through a kind of transitional phase at Cultural Resource with a new managing director, and most of our staff in Cairo are no longer working, and we are starting to hire a new staff, which is all based in Beirut. So we should be working on this network next year. How to apply? It's very simple. We have an email, we have application to be filled, and then we validate the case through, also we ask people to send us if they have any supporting documents or recommendation letters. Then we make a kind of validation to make sure that everything is correct when it comes to the information, and that our support goes to those who deserve it most. Then we have a consultative committee that would review the application and then would decide if this case falls within the interest of the program or not. We have general rules with regard to selecting the artists at risk. For example, support is not limited to art practices. For example, you can be at risk not because of your art practice. It can be you are facing something, a kind of social violence, or you are in a country where there's a state of war or political instability. But you should be a kind of either a practitioner yourself or a professional artist. Also, we have the issue of the quality of artwork, that quality of artwork is not the only criterion for us to decide about the case. The state of threat is what matters more. The program also, the target, it's not only the artists, we are also cultural operators, even researchers who are work in culture or whatever. Also, the idea of validation of requests is very important in this program, and this part is the program does it itself before moving the request to the committee. So we have a variety of artists or cases where we can support. Also we have some issues, like this brings us to the challenges we have. For example, we are not sure what we can provide or if we can provide the best help or support to those who have psychological issues, or those, for example, who have problems with production, like they can't work anymore for personal reasons, for whatever, but they are not under threat. It is as if their art or their production, their career is under threat. And until now, we don't have a real answer to how to help these people. Also, we have a couple of sensitive challenges. For example, sometimes we have laws that is employed by dictatorial regimes in order to suppress dissent. Such cases when artists are facing kind of, they are under law for any reasons, we shouldn't be contradicting or doing anything against the law, but sometimes you understand this is not the real case. Also, we have the last thing. We believe we should all the time keep a kind of low profile because this will be better for all the beneficiaries and also for the program. Though, of course, not anybody would like not to speak about their work. But we think it will be better to keep a low profile on the program and on the people whom we help. For example, we would not prefer to tell you about the 3 cases we supported from Yemen, Syria, Egypt in the last year. At the same time, we should keep high profile when it comes to announcing our work, because otherwise nobody would know that we do exist and would apply for us. That's it. It is be with art. كن مع الفن. We all are with art because it is one of the few things we do believe in. We still believe in. Thank you.
Folks, I understand we have about 30 minutes, and I wanted to just ask one question, or possibly 2, of the actual panelists. and then open it to the floor. I'm sure a lot of people want to input into this process. The conference itself is called Survival of the Artist, which presupposes, to a certain extent, that we support the notion, the survival of the artist. And I just wanted to put out a question, and I hope it's not too disingenuous. Why should art as a practice be allowed to survive? And I ask this question specifically in the context of the Middle East, specifically in the context of what's happening presently in the Middle East. And I'm not just talking about conflict. I'm not just talking about the single biggest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. I'm talking about the way in which art is increasingly marketed in the Middle East as part of an emerging market, which sounds like a neoliberal, sort of neo-colonial gambit. Equally, the way in which art is increasingly institutionalized in the context of the Middle East, both in public and private institutions. I counted 6 shows on presently on the notion of the Middle East and conflict. And it seems to be putting a lot of pressure on art to answer to these issues in and around politics, in and around migration, in and around the institutionalization of conflict as a way of reading the Middle East. And then the instrumentalization of art. And I'm not just talking about the context of the UAE. To give the UAE their credit, they're blatant when it comes to the process of instrumentalizing art. They hide behind nothing. I'm talking about the way in which art is being instrumentalized, for example, in Palestine, the way it's being instrumentalized in Istanbul, the way it's became part of a gentrification process in Amman, for example, and the way in which those processes are not just about soft power, they're about something else entirely. They are about a vanguard or a neoliberalization of art as an actual practice itself. So I want to ask the question, why should art as a practice be allowed to survive against this backdrop, as I've positioned it, and what can art do in these contexts? How can it counter what is an increasingly, as far as I'm concerned, a land grab in and around contemporary art practices in the Middle East? So I might just ask who wants to respond to this, or I might just throw it out there. Perhaps, William, you would like to jump in.
Can you hear me now? Yes? No, anyways, oh, there we go. I was going to say, I can probably speak loud enough. Well, I mean, the whole notion of why should art have a right to survive, I mean, is in itself, you're right, disingenuous. I mean, everyone has a right to produce and to create, and man, ever since the very beginning of time, has always made his mark on walls or in caves or whatever. I mean, the need for people to express themselves with some kind of optimism, with some kind of hope, has existed throughout time. And that's not going to stop, no matter, it has almost nothing to do with the art world whatsoever. I mean, people are going to, in their homes, they're going to decorate, and they're going to, whether it's in a gallery space, whatever, they're going to express themselves in some form whatsoever. But I really take up your point about this notion of the region and the way the region is formulated, because one of the things, when I was talking about us sitting around after the raid and strategizing, one of the biggest problems that we discussed and we faced was, of course, the outside threat of the legalities of working under the kind of conditions that we're working in the Middle East and in Egypt. But was basically what we, the term that you probably are familiar with, and it's crisis as an art form, and trying to deal with that crisis as an art form, and trying to be able to have discussions and educate young people that are trying to make their way into some kind of a system, to let them know how dangerous that is, because the lure and the seduction, particularly coming out of the West, for conflict as entertainment, and I haven't seen these shows, and I don't know what they are, really what you're talking about, but it is so, so dangerous for young people to feel that the work that they produce has to be categorized into these forms. Crisis as an art form, because this neoliberal kind of approach, what it does is that it destroys that urge and that need for people to be able to make that mark to express themselves. It tells people you have to express what they want And as I said, so when we were strategizing, we were talking about our local concerns. This was also probably one of the biggest problems that we faced when we were sitting around having discussions with young people, making people constantly aware of the dangers of this.
If I could sort of add a couple of points to that. Firstly, I sort of agree, Anthony, with your challenge. But what I would sort of throw back in its terms is I think art has this wonderful capacity to be multiple things at once. You know, so it is that super luxury good, it is that very problematic proposition for consumption, but it can also be a political urgency. It can also be a philosophical inquiry. And I think art, to sort of quote the Prince Claus Fund's logo, is a basic need. It's a basic human need. And then what forms it takes and how they circulate, that we get into different art worlds. And those are structures and those are about choices. And I don't know about you, and I think we will all as different individuals have different positions on this. But to me, the most interesting positions are not the hermit on top of the mountain, but people who roll up their sleeves and try and wrestle with it. In Tai Chi, in sort of Chinese moving meditation, there is this form where you play. It's called pushing hands. So where you're trying to find the other person's balance, and just with a gentle nudge to push them out of balance, and that requires listening. And I think for the art, certainly what I sort of strive to do, and I'm interested in artists who are striving in a similar way, who are pushing hands with the market, who are pushing hands with curators or institutions, and trying to sort of play with art's multiple capacities. The second point I note is that everything that you said about art in what I call West Asia would be equally applicable here in an institution with that wonderful title of the British Museum. So the idea of what is British, that's another symposium. We could sort of pick that up at another point in time. But I think there is this expansive and productive capacity that art allows people to be human.
Shireen?
Sorry, yeah.
I think it comes
Is it
on
on? Okay.
automatically.
So I would go back to another point. I think I totally agree with you, Hammad. And at the same time, art can be a lot of things all at the same time. And I think looking at the history, nothing comes out of nowhere. We always have to go back and see the history. The history of this region has always been a lot of, instability, a lot of violence, and what have you. But also look at the history of an artist, and this is what I was trying to say in my presentation. The ecosystem does not allow the artist to survive unless they, in the Middle East, if you look at Dubai, when Dubai and Qatar started buying, and when Art Dubai started rolling on, this is when the art of this region became on international forums. But other than that, we were nowhere. Art from our region was kind of very, very localized and very domestic. Never made it to the outside world. So now all of a sudden, artists need to survive because the system that supported them no longer, didn't have much support. But they need systems to support. There's a lot of responsibility on the shoulder of an artist. And the system is not there to support. So yes, they do need to survive because they do kind of reflect on our times and they reflect on us as people.
Mm-hmm. Ayman?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. I may even try to go to the extreme and say, okay, so why then we will have to work on, we have to support artists. Why don't we just focus on the usual human support aid, like healthy issues and medicines and food, which is of course very logic. But in fact, I think art is very special in few aspects. First of all, you can if all the problems yourself, you need support, you need help, you need like, as if there's a team. So I think a single artist can make a big change. Because also it's about feelings, like sharing others' feelings and understanding. I don't think most artists should have this gift of feeling others' pain, suffering, so reacting to it, or at least expressing their understanding and appreciation of it. Then it can matter for others as well. In addition to the great magic of imagination we have, because change is also about imagination, that you start to think creative and start from reality and think what could be the alternative. So if we don't have imagination, we don't have a very great weapon for change and for imagining things which are different, which can be better for you. Another point is about the creativity that was discussed in the previous session. Yes, I think we all should be creative. Even organizations should try to think differently when things have changed mainly in the last few years. So I think we all should change our strategies, programs, see what we can do. This is why our program, we just launched it last year because it was based on needs already existed. So I think we should all be creative. Artists should be creative, trying to saving themselves in whatever ways, and others as well. We should be creative when we try to find solutions to improving the environment where we live. Like we think on working on an artist would, the idea of if an artist will think about working on the laws in his country in order to improve the condition of his work, or try to think how to gather his colleagues or her peers in order to be united together and do something. So all these are creative ideas. So I should say I do believe in creativity, under which we have art as well.
I mean, let's take this notion of creativity and return to the idea. Of course, this panel is called Representing the Artist, and the commodification of creativity. And I noticed there was a performance earlier which was called The Artist Cannot Be Present Tonight, which I'm assuming is a reference to Marina Abramovic, her performance in MoMA. I don't know if any of the audience managed to see that. I wandered in by mistake. Marina Abramovic was holding court. The Artist is Present was the name of the actual performance that she did at that time. And it seemed to me increasingly that piece was very much about a kind of commodification of experience, the innermost desire. And again, of course, that's the great neoliberal project, to commodify our innermost desires. And I'm just wondering, if we return to your notion of creativity, Ayman, how do we represent the artist? How do you support creativity and at the same time avoid what I would see to be increasingly the problem? And for me, the problem is the art world. And I think William hit upon that, Hammad hit upon that, Shireen, you hit upon that. The problem for art today and the artist and creativity, for me personally, is increasingly the art world. So how do we support creativity and avoid these pitfalls at the same time? Or what new strategies can we use, given that art as a practice has changed radically in the last 2 decades?
Well, I think it is not easy. Maybe just we should start to be creative.
Start to be creative.
We should try to be creative. Mm-hmm. I mean...
So creative solutions towards creativity.
I think it should be about maybe critical thinking,
okay.
And evaluation of things, maybe listening to others, especially other opinions which are different to you. So I think it's about discussion. It's about talk and trying to figure it out, because I think you're right. Many things are just going like as if it is going on by momentum. But yes, we should stop and think about, ask the questions and try to find, but in fact, I don't have a real answer for this.
Well, I think, if I may, I mean, what you're suggesting here and what you suggested earlier is that creativity opens up a different horizon of engagement, an alternative horizon of engagement, potentiality, be it speculative or indeed pragmatic. Shireen, supporting creativity, how does one do this without falling into the usual pitfalls associated with the art world today?
It's not just the pitfalls, but any process of creating anything requires quite a lot of an open mind and free spirit, in a way. Yeah, and I think going back to the production, Syrian production, after the conflict, after the revolution, it's mind-blowing, the difference in mediums, in subjects, in representation, in every form of way. It's kind of opened a Pandora box, and just even though the change hasn't really gone in the way that we all hoped it would go, but you know, who would have thought that we would have artists producing in the way they're producing now? Change is very important, you know. So, and I think basically going back, and again, I'm probably a bit of an academic in my previous life, but I do hope that we always build on the past, because studying the past will kind of help us move into a much better future. But
Okay.
I think change and freedom.
Okay, never apologize for being an academic, by the way.
No, yeah, I know.
William, if you would, please, sir. Creativity and the support of.
Well, I mean, I kind of go back. I mean, I just want to pick up on what Shireen was saying, because I think that something very similar happened in Egypt in 2011. There was this just massive explosion of expression using all different kinds of mediums. And people that wouldn't normally be associated with the art world were suddenly out there making the loudest noise and with the most color. And they would never call themselves artists at any time whatsoever. And neither would the art world embrace them at any other time. But suddenly at that particular moment in time, that juncture, they did embrace them, I think. And that was the danger. So when this sort of creative flourish, this moment of opening occurred that allowed the ordinary laborer to be able to collaborate with a photographer, to be able to hold a performance in the middle of Tahrir Square on the 20th of January. I mean, it was spectacular, but that could not have happened if it wasn't for the labors of skills of being able to climb those poles over the years and years and years as a basic laborer to be able to carry out that performance. But I think that the problem then lies where the art world itself then rushes in and snaps that up and commodifies it, and then takes that laborer's work and takes that artist's photography and then channels it into something into the art market. And that is really where it becomes dangerous. And then when artists have to themselves, those people that identify as artists, to be able to work, as you were talking about, there wasn't any kind of sustainability until the Gulf happened. Well, I mean, while that was a huge encouragement for artists, and I mean, I know a lot of artists working in Egypt who all of a sudden, overnight, they were selling their work, and they were selling their work through the auction houses, through the galleries. And that was incredibly dangerous as well, because it was the galleries and the auction houses that were setting the prices. And now, here we are in 2017, the middle of a recession, and everybody's artwork's been sent home.
That's an element of losing freedom.
Yes.
Right? So you're not just free of political systems, you're free of other things as well.
Well, absolutely, but right now they're actually stuck with studios that are filled with work that they can't sell. I mean, I've always believed that art itself and art institutions should never be seen as sustainable. I really just don't think that is possible. I mean, I think and I don't think that there's an answer anywhere else, but of course, ideally, governments should support artists as they do in certain countries, and that would be the answer. But I just don't think a commercial system makes it sustainable.
And indeed, the model of production that's being utilized in the context of contemporary art practices is virtually and literally unsustainable. However, that will not stop that model of production being pursued. I think as well to think about Well, no, actually, Hammad, could you answer that in and around the notion of creativity?
Well, one of the things I go back to is I think we also have to, when we're talking, and forgive me, but in slightly paternalistic terms about the artists. And I think artists do have agency. And some of the best artists here are very alive to the issues that you've raised. And they play with us. And they hold themselves up to account to sort of exceed the possibilities of what the institution offers, to go beyond. And I don't think all artists do it every time, but they have that capacity. And just to take a very sort of local example, a couple of the last projects by Jeremy Deller, one in Manchester, sort of post the atrocity that happened there, which was 150 people and taken, selected from sort of quote unquote ordinary people, whatever that means. But people, and it was like, what is the city but it's people? There is no way of commodifying that. It's a huge budget project. And he's talked about it in an interesting way, saying he wants that production, he wants that budget to be used, but for it to be dispersed. And for that sort of to create certain, for experiences which touch people in ways that are not the same as walking into MoMA and queuing around the block. And I think we need to have faith in artists' capacity to do that. But ask ourselves as curators, running foundations or support mechanisms, as to what practices and projects we sort of put out, and what questions we ask ourselves when we do so. So one of the things, I don't know if you would have noticed, for instance, in that text, Gulf Return, Deepa Kuni-Krishnan, I was just looking at this. There were words that were blocked out. And that was part of one of the biggest negotiations we had to do, was to say, right, here are words that cannot circulate within the UAE, given certain laws. So how do we treat it? And after a sort of a long negotiation with the foundation that was supporting it, with the artist, we said, actually, the best way to do it would be to make it visible. That there are words that have been removed. So it could circulate, and with a little bit of creativity, you can guess what those words were. But to actually make that visible is actually far more powerful than just removing the words or rewriting them. And so just sort of simple things that would allow this thing to bleed beyond the container, which is the art institution.
Thank you, Ahmed. We have about 10 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen, and I would very much want to invite the audience to ask questions of the panelists. So if you would not mind putting up your hand, I think we have a microphone that's circulating. There is a lady sitting in the exact center of the room. You are the exact center of the room, by the way.
So a few of you guys are working in and around UAE, and you've mentioned before that UAE is a huge part of the art world and how it's actually become an international force. And we all know in this room that UAE has strict censorship guidelines. And how do you guys all believe that this monetary power and also international power has an effect on the artist while simultaneously censoring the artist when there are multiple things that are very relevant in the UAE that a lot of these artists aren't allowed to be talking about or expressing or showing?
So,
we're not in the UAE, so feel free.
I'll blurt it out. I think this is one of the reasons why you don't have a local art is primarily imported in the UAE. This is why you don't have a huge body of artists in the UAE, or for that matter in the Gulf. It's all Middle Eastern, and the ones who actually live and produce in the UAE are quite few. I think
I'd sort of disagree a little bit with you, Shireen, partly also because I think the way we think about art, so one of the things I wanted to do in this project about play was also to look at the genealogies of play. because I, like you, am very interested. I'm not a fan of what I call the unhinged contemporary. The contemporary that has no relationship to the past and was just born, probably somewhere around 1989. And in the UAE and in the region in general, there is a very lively and raucous practices of theater, of writing, of poetry. So one of the things we went back to was to look at what was that scene. And so if you look at people like Hassan Sharif, the artist, when he goes back to the UAE, the first from the UK, the first artist group he founds is with poets. And if you then read what they're writing, if you look at the kinds of performances that they're doing, I think there are very interesting things. It's just the lens with which we look at.
Yeah, and
the second point I'd want to, just briefly to pick on is, I've sort of worked pretty much all around the world. And I think the last big conference I was on, I was giving an example of a Dutch artist who did a project with a public sculpture of Queen Victoria in Wakefield. And that lasted 30 minutes before the council took it down. Yeah? Or where the work of Rashid Rana in Paris was taken off from the Musée Guimet, a work which was shown in Karachi. Yeah? So I think these ideas of these preconceptions of what is and what isn't censored, what is permissible, what isn't, I think, one, they're very simplistic. Two, I think what we need to be able to do, and smartly, is to be able to read where we are and do things which, again, will sort of exceed those limitations in a productive way.
And I'd like to add one more thing. I think the UAE, yes, it's not just the freedom of expression, but I think what they've done in other ways sort of supports arts in a very big way. So the marriage of private and public support, whether it's the galleries or the museums or the initiatives, like Bergil Foundation and the others. So I think it is not just the freedom of expression in a way, but we probably, as you said, we probably need to look at it in a more holistic manner. And I think they have a model that has worked perfectly well and pretty much very impressively over the past 10 years, all of a sudden. Now,
No, I mean, just to support that point, I mean, one of the things, only half jokingly, that I sort of point out to artists in the UAE, so when I was doing all these studio visits for the pavilion, is, God, if I was a young artist today, this is the place where I would be. Because there, the number of people who are running after you to support you for, production grants, fellowships, there's a different type of risk that comes with it.
Historically, if you looked at, art in Egypt, for instance, versus art in the UAE, and this is what I meant, it is not, it is very different. It is extremely different. I think what they've done over the past 10 years is tremendous, amazing. And the marriage, as I said, between private and public is just fantastic.
May I ask, you have a professional interest in this, obviously.
Oh, I was banned from UAE.
You were banned from the UAE?
Yes,
okay.
and I'm an artist, so...
Well, that's probably a badge of honor, I would think, in this day and age, to be banned from the... I'm waiting to be banned from the UAE.
I'm just very concerned because it has huge impacts on artists like me from the Middle East who want to talk about a lot of things which relate to the Middle East and the art world, and I create a lot of very controversial work and also erotic work, which is not allowed to be shown in the country. And I still have collectors within the UAE. So it really is an interesting thing when you are not allowed the opportunity to receive the funds from the institutions because you are banned or allowed to participate in those conversations within the country. Because I think that's a huge issue, is to be able to be a thriving artist, you need the financial support, and then that turns into censorship when you are cut off from a huge pool of funds.
I think just...
Sorry, could I just also, of course, disagree with you with respect? Coming out of, I had this conversation with a filmmaker and artist, Abbas Kiarostami, who's sort of no more, in Iran, around exactly these conversations about censorship, what could you do? And his response was almost like, well, if I could do anything, I wouldn't know what to do. So there was almost this element of, and I don't think he was being disingenuous. There was this element of saying it's actually the restrictions that force you to be creative. At least that was his reading. And to me, that again is kind of interesting, because I think it's those strategies, those possibilities that I've particularly found, for me, more interesting than, if it's carte blanche.
I would just also add to this that one needs to be careful. This notion of freedom of expression, to return to the point just made, that's precisely one of the gambits that the Allied forces put together: freedom of expression, democracy, free markets, that they were going to sell to the Iraq people, the people of Iraq, in the lead up to the 2003 invasion. So it's a very interesting way in which the Middle East is consistently articulated around issues of lack of freedom of expression, lack of democracy, lack of a free market, and hence we, the West, will bring it to them, whether they like it or not, or indeed whether they ask for it or not. So it's a very complex idea, this freedom of expression. But William, could I just return to censorship, given your first-hand experience of it, and how do you articulate censorship as a creative process and not just a negative process?
Well, I mean, I think what Hammad said is interesting in that point, that with those restrictions, then people actually are able to build around them and think of ways of extending. And I think that's what people do, quite frankly. I mean, the more restrictions that are put in place, the more. I mean, it is incredibly difficult. There is no question about that. And no, I don't think anyone likes to face those kind of restrictions to look for a creative process. But I would turn around and say that I don't necessarily think also that that's what drives a lot of production in a lot of these countries. I mean, I think that you don't need those restrictions to be able to produce, to make the most interesting piece of work. I mean, if you look at Egypt itself, and just in the last 20 years, a lot of the work that came out of that, that comes out of the country, it doesn't deal with things that they weren't. I mean, people are always saying, well, you can't deal with the nudes, or you can't do. Well, quite frankly, I have never had an artist produce any work that has said to me, here, are you going to be able to show this, or I know that it's nudes. But nobody's brought it. It's not subjects that people are even remotely interested in, because there's far greater things of interest right on the ground. I mean, when you said about history, I mean, Egypt has thousands and thousands of years of history, and that doesn't mean people have to go back to the pyramids. People only need to go across the road and look at the deteriorating buildings to make artworks about infrastructure. And so, I mean, censorship is important. At one point, it drives some people, but it's not a major factor in the creative process.
Thank you, William.
I don't think.
Thank you. We do have time for one more question, but it'll have to be rather urgent. There's a gentleman to the far left in the very front.
It's a question and also a quick comment. The question is, in terms of issues you've had with the state, with censorship and so on, how do you find it's related to the audience? So if the work or the artist, the performance is targeted towards certain sort of, I guess in British terms you'd call liberal elite audiences, you'd have less an issue than if it's something that's much more mass, more likely to create change, I suppose, in a way. My comment as well was that I find it somewhat astonishing that we have a female Middle Eastern artist who has suffered under a lack of freedom of expression and banned from the UAE, and to be told that that's in some way a Western idea.
Do you want me to answer to that specifically? I mean, just to clarify what I was saying, the way in which freedom of expression has been instrumentalized by Western governments as a means to verify and indeed quantify invasion, I think is problematic. So it's not just a simple case of freedom of expression. I think there's more to unpack. What do you guys?
No, look, there's no question of saying, oh yes, let's celebrate being banned. And although, I don't think anybody goes into production of art to want to be banned. If they do, good luck to them. But the question, but I think I completely agree with Anthony here, that this is not a simple binary. And reducing things to a simple binary actually doesn't do anybody favors. I mean, I'm originally from Pakistan. And quite often you get away with a lot of things in the art world because art is not important. It's not going to get covered by certainly Urdu language media, or it's not going to get covered by television. It will be covered by, as you say, the quote-unquote liberal elite, and who cares? Because that will not cause political fractions. So sometimes you have much more leeway to be able to get away with things that you wouldn't in other circumstances. I do, however, think that artists and institutions and curators also have a responsibility to think about what they're doing and not rely, just on prima facie, yes, it's sort of a freedom of expression, because therein lies, that's a very slippery slope to kind of, the Second Amendment and freedom to bear arms and all of that kind of thing. That becomes kind of an orthodoxy. And I do think art is a place where you can have productive conversations that challenge orthodoxies. And there have got to be creative ways. I think provocation is quite often quite a simple, sometimes it's effective, but it can be quite a simplistic way of trying to combat orthodoxies.
Ayman, could you respond to that very briefly? We have about 1 more minute. Please, Ayman.
His last point about...
Or, just around the issue of censorship, freedom of expression, how do you negotiate that? How do you navigate it?
Okay, yes, we always have a problem with censorship. It can be now like self-imposed by the artist. You also, this takes us back to the idea of being creative. You have to express yourself without being you should try to express yourself in a way that make you accessible, and people will say okay to listening to you or attending your performance. So you are partly responsible for this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think also those who have more problems with the state with regard to censorship are, of course, they have to be more creative than others. But of course, they are unlucky because as long as you have options, it's very good. You shouldn't be deprived of options. One last thing I can say about... I forgot.
Is it coming back? No? Shireen, just some closing remarks. We have about 30 seconds.
Closing remarks, right?
Or
okay.
indeed address any of the issues.
I have to say, I mean, personally, I think, I truly think it is a responsibility, and I think each one of us sitting here, or even in the audience, each one of us is acting on an element of feeling responsible towards arts and history and culture in the Arab world. And I think this is just, something that drives us, that gives us a lot of drive, all of us.
William? I'm trying to be democratic for what it's worth.
I mean, I just wanted to very quickly, when you talked about facing censorship in terms of if a work is more challenging and you have a very sort of liberal, sort of isolated audience. I mean, that is absolutely true. But at the same time, you also have mediums. Like, for example, if you were talking about the visual arts, I mean, the visual arts can get away with a lot more, in my opinion. But if you're talking about theater, performance, and public performance in the streets, I mean, particularly in Egypt, that is very dangerous, because that reaches out and talks to the people at every single level. So that's the language that the guy in the street, performance is what he understands, it's what he relates to. So it's dangerous. But photography and painting, you can get away with a lot more.
I think you might have just remembered what you momentarily forgot.
Yes, well, I think we are very small compared to world powers and ruling regimes. Mm-hmm. But we have only imagination, we have creativity, we just have potential. So we should try to survive. Mm-hmm. We have, because anything can change. We can find new ideas at any time. But if we don't exist, we don't have any options. So we should do our best to survive and be ready for the right moment.
I think that's a great place to end. I've been told there is a comfort break and we resume in 15 minutes. No? When do we resume?
5 minutes.
That's a very short comfort break. I'd like to thank our panelists, Ayman, Shireen, William, and Hammad. Thank you, folks.